ever want to shy away from ultimately paying attention to the spiritual realm as well, because we're a body soul composite.
Mm-hmm.
But it's tricky, and in some ways, I think paying attention to the spiritual gives you an inroad to the psychological.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a counselor and social worker for over 12 years, and I've wrestled with this question: is mental illness from the inside, or is it possible that it's spiritual forces at work? Watch some of the evidence.
She began to believe that she was possessed. She believed that she was possessed by 6 different demons, including Lucifer, with total 67 rites of exorcism in such a short period of 9 months. Many of those sessions were recorded, and they are still available online.
And I am a Christian counselor who believes that the Bible is veracious and true, and that puts me at odds with many of the psychological fellows and those who are working within the industry of mental health and delivering to those who suffer from mental illness, as well as substance use addiction and others. So, can we find evidence in the Bible that, in fact, demons or spiritual forces or principalities of the air are still working and are still affecting what we might call mental illness today? Ephesians 6:12 says that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. And so, am I to take that when I'm suffering from something that it's impossible that it could be literally the Bugs Bunny cartoon with the devil on one and the angel on another part of your shoulder? Is it possible that it is in fact external forces that are being compelled by the spiritual warfare around us that are affecting my mental health? I think it's very possible. So as a mental health provider, do I tell my clients, or do I give them any potential possibility that that problem could be coming from spiritual forces? If I'm depressed, am I having externalized issues that are coming through as a spiritual warfare incarnation? It's very possible. And if I tell someone that, if I give them that as license to believe that their problems might not be completely internal, it might in fact be empowering to them. It might give them some peace of mind knowing that it wasn't just them. It's not just that they're broken, although they are. It's not just inside of them. There may be external forces going on. And the problem with psychology is that so much of this is immeasurable. So much of it is according to subjective report. And while we can measure the symptoms and the outcomes, we simply cannot measure much about the mind itself, which has more to do with soul and spirit than it does just this framework that's all physically created and has nothing to do with the soul. In John 10:10, Jesus says, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that you may have life and life abundantly." So he might be compelling us that if we're experiencing these symptoms of something else, like depression, like anxiety, potentially there is a spiritual solution to those symptoms.
And never true. People come to you because their lives are so damn complicated, they cannot stay on top of them in any way that doesn't make it look like they're just going to get more complicated. And so then that causes symptoms. You know, it's like, there's this old idea, it's sort of a metaphor for genetic susceptibility. Take a balloon and blow it up until it's beyond its tolerance, it's going to blow out at the weakest point. Well, that's sort of what a genetic susceptibility is. If I just keep adding complexity on top of you, at some point you'll blow out at your weakest point. You know, maybe you'll get physiologically ill, maybe you'll start drinking, maybe you'll develop an anxiety disorder, maybe you'll get OCD, maybe you'll get depressed, whatever. There'll be something about you that's the weakest point, and if I just push, that's where you'll blow out. So
now there's a psychological tension that comes into this. There are a great many psychologists, nearly every psychologist, that would say that there are chemical imbalances or perhaps aberrations in the brain, and that makes this atypical behavior or tendencies towards atypical behavior with the complex things that come about during life that might just trigger. So like a balloon, as described by Jordan Peterson, when you push on a balloon, the weakest point will be the place where it pops. And so if you already have a genetic predisposition toward a mental illness and you push on the balloon of your life with trauma or other things like that, it could be the weakest point that gives way, which might give way to things like anxiety, which I've personally experienced and had previously years ago taken medication for, much to my chagrin now. So is it possible that there are the ways that our brain is created within the natural order and the natural law of God's creation, that we do have predisposed weaknesses that might lead to mental illness that are simply a physical incarnation of the unrest inside? Yes, it is possible. But if I press on that lever with a client or someone who comes in that says that they see demons, if I press on the lever that, well, maybe they have a brain tumor or there's another natural solution or hypothesis as to why they're going through that, it might also be fruitful to press on the spiritual lever and ask them, have you considered that this could also be a spiritual malady, or maybe it's both? And of course, we cannot measure that. And that's why both psychology and spiritual warfare may fail to explain the entirety of the problem. Watch this from Matt Fradd.
Yeah. I think it's tough, man. That's a really difficult, it's really hard, I think. And it's hard for a couple of reasons. One, because we're a hylomorphic unity. We're a body-soul composite, right? And so when you have psychological issues, that can have spiritual consequences. And when you're having spiritual issues, there can be psychological consequences. And so there is this sort of difficulty in trying to get really, really clear on it. But for me, generally speaking, I would say something like cause and treatment. So something like, what is this arising from? Is this arising from like habitual sin or some sort of sinful immoral behavior? Did that precede the problem?
Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, who I think was probably more projecting. He came up with the term projection, which means that you assume that other people have the same problems that you do, and then you place that motivation upon them. I think he projected a lot of his own issues onto his clients and henceforth onto the field of psychology. But he said this about religion. Religion is an illusion, and it derives its strength from the fact that it falls in with our instinctual desires. And he's right about one thing. We do have an inherent instinctual tendency towards seeking things of the spirit, seeking the rationale for a higher power. And I know this in part because the people who come to me who are severe and persistently mentally ill, they often have a spiritual bend toward their delusions, toward their paranoia, or maybe it's not a delusion. Maybe they're seeing something that we in fact don't see and that psychology chooses to dismiss, which is that there are actually spiritual forces around them, and perhaps they're actually just more in tune to those forces. And so when they come to me with that, I often tell them, I'm not here to tell you you're wrong. Perhaps you're seeing something that I cannot see. And therefore, if you find a viable solution within your religiosity, within your Christian faith, within your belief, within your prayer life, move forward with that solution, and I'll fight with you in that. But it's just an impossibility in our modern psychology to bring in spiritual warfare. The psychologists won't accept it. And oftentimes these faith-based universities, like two of them that I've been to, Indiana Wesleyan and Liberty University, I find that they over-psychologize and under-spiritualize. Now, I would say from my personal experience, Liberty University has been much more forthright about the faith-based aspects to what's going on in the psychology of an individual, and Indiana Wesleyan was much more likely to psychologize it. So Liberty spiritualizes it, Indiana Wesleyan much more psychologizes it, but both of them fall short in my opinion. Now, let me give you a percentage. I believe that it is 50-50 spiritual to psychological, in the onset, root, and perpetuation of mental illness, but I also am willing to accept that it could be 80% spiritual and 20% psychological or physical. We do know that C.S. Lewis talks about the natural order, natural law, God's creation, and the cause and effect that happens when things are imposed upon that creation, like a life of sin or the sin of another, the free will of another imposing itself upon you. So it's very possible that this problem does have some physical aspects, but I'm willing to go 80-20 because I see Jesus healing and casting out spiritual maladies in such a fashion that he attributes nearly all of it to being spiritual. And so if that's, yes, he does heal the sick, he heals the lame. So not all of those are perhaps possession. But when it comes to the mentally unwell that he interacts with, we see that the overwhelming majority of it he attributes to demonic forces, and then he acts in such a fashion to cast those out. Now, perhaps those are just the ones that are recorded in Scripture, and some little anxious girl came to him and said, "I've been having anxiety," and he said, that's a physical attribution. Here, go forth and sin no more. And perhaps he did heal in those ways. Perhaps the woman who touched his robe was, in fact, suffering from anxiety, and that did not necessarily have a spiritual component to it. However, the recorded diction in the Bible that we find about mental unrest, Jesus attributes very frequently to the Spirit. Regardless of whether this problem is primarily spiritual or primarily psychological, I still want you to try to seek help if you need it. So for the dads out there can be reasonably good counselors who are of a faith-based orientation. Go seek help. And for anyone else who's suffering from this, or if you have kids who are suffering and being given diagnoses that you think might be over psychologizing something or under spiritualizing something, go seek a greater counsel. Start in your church, move towards mental health counseling or vice versa, but get the best of both worlds if you can, because I have learned things during my counseling time as a counselor that can help, that are interventions that have nothing to do with the Spirit. And I have learned things in my walk as a Christian that have nothing to do essentially with psychology, but can help when you're suffering from mental illness. So if you need help, go out there and get it. Now, I want to start the conversation. If you believe that this is more attributable to spirituality, comment spiritual in the comments below. If you think that it's more clinical and there are physical representations of mental health problems, comment clinical. And if you think that they should be pressed forward, that counseling should be pressed forward with a more biblical lens, comment more biblical underneath in the comments. Let's start a conversation. Is it possible that this is a spiritual malady that we're over psychologizing when it comes to our current mental health crisis? I believe it's possible. Let's see what we find out.